Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexis Johnson, and I am a rising third year doctoral student in the Social Foundations of Education program at the University of Virginia School of Education. I also serve as a graduate research assistant with Dr. Aldridge on the Teachers in the Movement project. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for our third installment of the Teachers in the Movement webinar series. Today, we are thankful to have as co-sponsors of this webinar, the Center for Civil Rights History and Research and the Center for the Education and Equity of African American Students, both of the University of South Carolina. And thank you to Charlottesville's Epsilon Psi Boule of Sigma Pi Phi fraternity for their co-sponsorship of this webinar. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Teachers in the Movement, the project was born in 2014 by Dr. Derek Aldridge, Professor of Education at the University of Virginia. Operating from the premise that teachers played an integral part in the movement, for example, not only as members of civil rights organizations like the NAACP, but also as teachers in the classroom. Our team interviews largely unknown teachers and educators who taught between 1950 and 1980 and who espoused ideals of equality, democracy, self-determination, and freedom through their pedagogy. To date, the team has conducted several hundred interviews with educators in 5 states: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. We also interview individuals who were not educators, but who were seminal figures of the movement. Our first webinar, for example, illuminated the life of civil rights icon, Dr. Wyatt T. Walker. While this series was born as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as part of our team's continuing efforts to find new ways of sharing these important oral histories, this particular webinar, Documenting the Movement, comes as the nation experiences yet another wave of the great American endemic, racism, as we have witnessed the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Rayshard Brooks, and several others. And as on tomorrow, we commemorate
I can't hear
the of the murder of 9 Black parishioners in Charleston, South Carolina. For today's webinar, we will view and discuss selections of interviews from 2 artists who documented the movement, Mr. Cecil Williams and Dr. Leo Twiggs. Cecil Williams is a native of Orangeburg, South Carolina, and holds a BA in art from Claflin University, an acclaimed photographer of the civil rights movement in South Carolina. Williams photographed seminal figures such as Thurgood Marshall, Septima Clark, and President Kennedy during his career. Dr. Leo Twiggs, a native of St. Stephen, South Carolina, is an acclaimed painter known for employing the batik method. He holds a BA from Claflin University, an MA from NYU, and was the first African American to earn a doctorate in art education from the University of Georgia. We have several panelists here today who will help guide our discussion and who will introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jada Kennerly. I am a sociology major at Oberlin College in Ohio, but I was born in Charleston, South Carolina. My dad is from Orangeburg, South Carolina, where he went to Winthrop, and met my mom, who's also from Lancaster, South Carolina. So I'm a Ohio girl with a lot of Southern roots, and I am working as a summer intern on the Teachers in the Movement project with Dr. Aldridge.
Hi all, again, my name is Alexis Johnson. I'm a rising third year doctoral student in the Social Foundations of Education program at the University of Virginia School of Education. And as a student of Dr. Aldridge, I serve as a graduate research assistant with the Teachers in the Movement project in the Center for Race and Public Education in the South. I'll be serving as a co-host today along with Jada. And I'm also very excited about today's webinar as I am a native of South Carolina.
My name is Ken Twiggs. I am a native of Orangeburg, South Carolina. I'm the son of Leo Twiggs. I actually grew up in Orangeburg and spent a significant amount of my formative years living actually on the campus of South Carolina State. I've been an associate and friend of Professor Aldridge for a long time, and it's a pleasure to be involved in this project.
I'm Candace Cunningham, and I am a professor of history at Florida Atlantic University. My research is on South Carolina school teachers who were in the civil rights movement from about World War I to the early 1970s. So I'm very excited to be here.
Good afternoon. My name is Bobby Donaldson. I'm a professor of history at the University of South Carolina, where I direct the Center for Civil Rights History and Research. I'm also the lead scholar for an initiative entitled Columbia SC 63 that is very much associated with the work of Dr. Twiggs and Cecil Williams. Both of these gentlemen have been mentors to me since I joined the university 20 years ago, and I'm very pleased to be here today to reflect on their extraordinary journeys.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Hathcock. I am a videographer by profession, and I specialize in oral history preservation through video documentation. I have had the distinct pleasure of working with Dr. Aldridge since the inception of Teachers in the Movement work with documenting the work of these teachers, educators, and administrators and their contributions to civil rights. And I am very excited that we are able to share some of our recordings and interviews with you all today for informative discussion from their unique perspective as artists capturing this movement. Thank you all very much.
Hello, my name is Derek Aldridge, and I am a professor in the Curry School of Education, and I also serve as the founding director of the Teachers in the Movement Project. I'd like to welcome everyone here today. Thank you.
Before we begin, I want to encourage the audience to please ask questions in the Q&A box if something piques your interest. Please include your name and any affiliation with your question. We hope to answer as many questions or comments as we can at the conclusion of the discussion. So to set some context for today's discussion, I want to begin by asking the panelists to discuss the correlation between the historical moment that we are experiencing with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Civil Rights movement.
So just let me say that Mr. Williams and Dr. Twiggs speaks to us today more now than ever. They are legends in my home state of South Carolina, and they're also national treasures because through their art, we are able to tell the story of Black life and the African-American experience. Whenever I look at the work of Mr. Williams and Dr. Twiggs, I'm reminded of something that Roy Wilkins said at the March on Washington in 1963. He said, in order to understand this historic moment in 1963, you need to go back and look at Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. I would argue, in order to understand what's taking place with Black lives in 2020, and to understand the Black experience in 2020, we need to spend some time with the work of Mr. Cecil Williams and Dr. Leo Twiggs. Thank you.
Well, I think as I look at the work of Dr. Twiggs and Cecil Williams, both of these men remind us of the long arc of the civil rights movement. And they both anticipated moments that we're experiencing today, understood very well that the struggle was ongoing, never ending, recognized that young people would play a critical role then and now. And it really helped us to document this struggle over time. Dr. Twiggs at one point in the longer interviews that were recorded in this series said there will come a point where people's frustrations will give way to another struggle. He said this before we were at this moment where we are in the present time. So I think their large body of work reminds us of multiple movements, multiple parts of a movement, and multiple organizations and individuals who have shaped this movement over generations.
And I just wanted to add, when we sort of recognize that we're in a really important historical moment, it's important to sort of actively record that history. So for instance, today we're watching video clips of oral histories. And of course, these were done by professional historians and professional videographers, but you do not have to be a professional in order to record your history. And having this history recorded is a very big part of being able to tell the story later, right? And correlate it with future stories as well as past ones.
Thank you, panelists, for giving us that wonderful insight, comparing yesterday's movement with today. I'd like to follow up with a question. So as the focus of today's webinar is on South Carolina, I'd like to ask the panelists to discuss the significance of South Carolina in the long civil rights movement.
So I wanted to talk about South Carolina's early civil rights movement and the role that teachers played in that movement. So the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, arrives in South Carolina during the World War I era. And this is part of an earlier, bigger effort, essentially to grow the NAACP into a mass mobilization movement. And they realize that the only way to do that, right, is to move into the South. And so they create these first two chapters in 1917 in South Carolina, in Charleston and Columbia. And they try out a few different campaigns. The most successful of these campaigns is the Black Teacher Hiring Campaign in Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston did not hire Black teachers in the city schools. And so they have this campaign to get Black teachers hired within the city limits. And what this means is that what the NAACP learns is that the issue on which African Americans are willing to literally sign their name on the dotted line is going to be education, right? And so education is going to be the key to creating a mass mobilization movement.
And to build on Dr. Cunningham's assessment, I'm very excited that we're having this discussion because it enables us to turn the mirror of history to South Carolina. When I joined the faculty of the university 20 years ago, there were some well-meaning people who told me not much happened in this state of significance or consequence. And the interviews that have been done by this project, the work of so many others, have challenged that directly. I mean, if we would just look beyond the World War II period, and we see just today is the 76th anniversary of the electrocution of a young man named George Stinney, a 14-year-old boy who was wrongly convicted of assault on two white girls in Alcaloo, South Carolina. That sparked a movement of protest about racial violence in South Carolina, around the country. Or if we look 10 years later, in 1954, we all know about the Brown v. Board decision, but many may not know that one of the real thrust cases of that Brown v. Board decision was indeed Briggs versus Elliott out of a small community in Clarendon County, South Carolina. And Thurgood Marshall was the lead attorney in that case before the Supreme Court. Or if you look within weeks of the Brown v. Board decision, many may not know the story of a 20-year-old young woman whose name was Sarah Mae Fleming, who challenged bus segregation in Columbia, South Carolina in the summer of 1954. Her case, Fleming versus SCE&G, was then used in the arguments of the Rosa Parks case, the Broderick case in Montgomery, 17 months later. Many may know of the Greensboro 4, February 1st, 1960, but some may not know of the important consequences that happened in Greensboro, where young people across the South, in nearly every major city in South Carolina, followed their lead. Many may not know that in Orangeburg, on March 14th, 1960, over 300 young men and women marched in protest of segregation in downtown Orangeburg. They were attacked by police. They were attacked by fire hoses. They were attacked by tear gas. And on the next day, the New York Times headline story was about the young men and women, not in Montgomery or Selma or Greensboro, but in Orangeburg, South Carolina. So this initiative that we're undertaking today is critical, I think, to remind us of the many movements that took place in the state of South Carolina and to pay tribute to the men and women who helped to fight that fight over 6 decades ago.
I'd like to add something, and I think this is in the context of, really the roots of education, especially as it pertains to Orangeburg, South Carolina. I mean, when you look at the history, and as a person who grew up in that city, the history of Orangeburg, South Carolina, really for African Americans really starts very early on in terms of higher education. Claflin University, which both my father and Mr. Williams attended, was formed in 1868, which is in the throes of this hopeful period for African Americans in the South after the Civil War, where Reconstruction was in full swing. It'd been 4 years since the war was over, and there was this hopefulness that there would be this opportunity, this change that would happen that I think we all know now was kind of false hope. But I think the education of African Americans in South Carolina was very well rooted in that belief of this opportunity to get an education, build a community, build this network, so to speak, of people who were former slaves, who were children of slaves, for the first time to be able to get, an education. And that was, I think, a coalescing point within South Carolina, and certainly within Orangeburg, of the roots of what would later become the training ground and opportunities for those people who later became the leaders of the civil rights movement in education in South Carolina.
I'd just like to add that Mr. Williams and Dr. Twiggs' work has really inspired me in many ways to study South Carolina as a major site of the civil rights movement. I'm from Rock Hill, South Carolina, where in 1961, a group of students at the local college, community college, Friendship College, decided to sit in at a five and dime for lunch and refused to pay their bail after they were arrested. Those students ended up doing 30 days in the York County chain gang and helped to start a movement which was called the Jail No Bail Campaign. And this group of students was called the Friendship Nine. Rock Hill, South Carolina was also the site of Freedom Rides, where the legend John Lewis was beat very badly in Rock Hill, and recently came back to Rock Hill to have a conversation with the man who beat him up. And so Rock Hill has a rich history of civil rights activity, as well as having his first Black graduate is from Rock Hill. Winthrop's first Black graduate is from Rock Hill, South Carolina as well, and her name is Cynthia Plairati. So these gentlemen's work really has really helped me to engage civil rights in the upstate of South Carolina, particularly in my hometown of Rock Hill.
Thank you, panelists, so much for giving us that information, incredibly valuable context for our discussion today. And it's actually a perfect segue as we begin looking at the clips for today. And so in this first clip, Mr. Williams discusses the significance of teachers to the civil rights movement in South Carolina.
Teachers had a great respect that we gave them, in fact, the greatest respect, probably equal to that of an attorney or a doctor in the community. They were the backbones. They were the sanity of this whole thing about where we people are, a society where we are judged by the color of our skin rather than what we can really do in the content of our character. I look upon my teachers as some of the bravest people really that I've ever met. The unfortunate thing about it is many of them do not find their stories and their sacrifices and the things that they endured in our history books. They were the persons that I would call them, let me coin a word and steal this word from a story that I ran about one of my pictures in Jet magazine, where 21 teachers at Ellery Training School, because South Carolina was trying to punish those people involved with the NAACP. These people in 1956 resigned their jobs rather than deny their membership in the NAACP. They stood up, they gave up their livelihoods in Ellery, South Carolina in 1956. Again, when the state of South Carolina comes up with a law that says, before we give you a job in the school system, are you a member of the NAACP? And if they had to sign that, they resigned rather than deny their membership. They were that much supporters. Actually, some of them, of the 20 that did that in that photograph that I did for Jet magazine, really weren't members, but they never just stood up for really the principle of having to put that, and they supported it whether or not they actually were paid members or not. That picture in 1956 that I took of those 21 Ellery school teachers was so important to Jet. It was printed across 2 pages in Jet. Jet doing that those days was just a very small publication. And for one of my photographs to appear across the full 2 pages kind of gives you an idea of how much Jet and the national press felt about what those teachers were doing. It was symbolic of them say, take this very brave stand and to put your livelihood on the line. That kind of sacrifice by teachers, in fact, it's one of the bravest acts I've ever seen from any group of people. And it was the Ellery school teachers who really became the symbol of that. But so many other instances where teachers would really put their lives on the lives and livelihood online to really stand up for their students. They had to be the hero in the classroom as well because their students looked up to them. So the teachers of America aren't given the credit that should be due. They're the ones that should be in the history books. They were the ones that really kept the civil rights movement safe, even before Martin Luther King's call for nonviolence. And they were the ones that would give us the values. They were the ones that on a day-to-day basis were closest to us, and they knew that we would listen to them. They were our leaders. They were our leaders in the community. They were our leaders in all aspects of our lives, and so important to us.
Did you meet Septima Clark, speaking of teachers?
Yes, I did. I photographed her, and she was also one of the bravest persons I've ever seen. History has a funny way, and historians, a lot of times newspapers have a funny way of dealing, have an unusual way of dealing sometimes with historians. For example, in Martin Luther King's time, because Septima Clark had done so many things before we even knew of Reverend Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, he called her the mother of the civil rights movement. But historians later changed it to be Rosa Parks. And it's the strangest thing. But evidence of this can be found in who did the Reverend Martin Luther King take with him to Norway to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. He didn't take Rosa Parks. He took Septima Clark of Charleston, South Carolina, who had put herself and her life and her livelihood on the line by going up against segregated facilities in Charleston, speaking up for the community. And as a very, in fact, she would be one of the most underrated civil rights heroes of the entire civil rights movement, in my opinion.
We just heard from Mr. Williams discuss some very, very important teachers to the South Carolina movement, including Septima Clark, who many of us that study the civil rights movement know very well as the maybe a lesser known story, the teachers of the Ellery Training School. So panelists, do you all have any commentary on the importance of teachers in these teachers in particular to the civil rights movement, but also to the larger movement as a whole?
So Cecil Williams said a couple of things that I wanted to focus on. The first thing was, he said, we gave them the greatest respect, probably equal to that of an attorney or doctor. And I think some people today might be surprised to kind of hear that, but I think it's important to think about why these teachers garnered so much respect. And a lot of that had to do with the opportunities that were available, or I should say were not available to African Americans, especially African American women. Most college educated Black women went into teaching or nursing. And this kind of philosophy was really so deeply ingrained in kind of Black middle class culture that even when their daughters and their granddaughters went to college, when I went to college, I come from a family of teachers. When I went to college, all of my aunts, my mom, all said, you know, you should really get your teaching certificate, even though they all knew I didn't want to be teachers, right? Because teaching is what ambitious, intelligent women did in their view. And then I also wanted to talk about the Ellery teachers in particular. I love this picture that Cecil Williams took of them in front of the Ellery Training School. So what happens is in 1956, the state of South Carolina, they passed what was called the anti-NACP oath. The state legislature passed this new law, and the new law basically said government employees could not be members of the NACP. This law is passed, and everyone from Roy Wilkins to Septima Clark to James Hinton all say the point of this law is to target Black teachers. So everyone immediately knew what this was about. And I think that tells us one really important thing, and that is everyone understood that Black teachers garnered a certain amount of respect and had a certain amount of political currency, right, within the Black community. So these 21 teachers lost their jobs, but bear in mind, teachers across the state of South Carolina lost their jobs. Septima Clark was one of those teachers. What was different about the Ellery case was that you had 21 teachers at the same school at the same time that all lost their job. And that is immediately connected to this questionnaire, and you see a couple of pictures of that. This questionnaire included really invasive questions, like, are you a member of the NACP, right? And these teachers say, hey, that's unconstitutional, you can't ask me that. It also included really insulting questions, like, do you think you're qualified to teach in an integrated classroom? And that question actually made them very angry. This case goes to court. It goes all the way up to the US Supreme Court. And eventually South Carolina basically reverses this law rather than arguing it in front of the US Supreme Court. But what this court case proves, the Ellery case in particular, is that teachers were consistently placed at the center of this political struggle. And that's demonstrated with this case, with the teacher salary equalization cases in the 1940s, with the earlier case that I mentioned of the Black teacher hiring campaign. So African-American teachers were not only important to the civil rights movement, they are really integral in creating what we think of as a mass mobilization movement.
Well, I'll just add, it's great to have former students like Dr. Cunningham who can explain very succinctly where we are historically. And for those who are watching, this is 1955, 1956. This is 1 year after the landmark Supreme Court ruling, Brown versus Board of Education, Briggs versus Elliott. And very immediately, almost immediately, the NACP and local organizers realized the fight for justice is really just beginning, despite a Supreme Court ruling. And in South Carolina and across the South, you find what historians have called massive resistance by white leaders who are cracking down on the NACP and other civil rights organizations. They're penalizing teachers and others for daring to believe in a different future for themselves and for their students. And so Septima Clark, Reverend Joseph Delane and his family all are victimized as a result of their civil rights support. But in 1955, November of 55, Thurgood Marshall comes back to South Carolina, reminding people that the struggle continues. He speaks in Columbia, South Carolina Then he leaves from Columbia and he goes to Orangeburg, and he speaks on the campus of Claflin College. Now, ironically, a photograph is taken of Thurgood Marshall on the stage with a who's who of civil rights leaders, and it's taken by a young high school student named Cecil Williams. Now, ironically, the editor of the campus newspaper at Claflin in November of 1955 is a young artist, English major named Leo Twiggs, both witnessing this historic moment. Both were mindful of what's happening in their own community as people are being penalized for engaging in a boycott against the local business leaders who continue to practice segregation. But also in that audience in November of 1955, when Thurgood Marshall speaks, is a young art professor whose name is Arthur Rose. Arthur Rose was not fired from his job because he's taught at a private African-American college. But Arthur Rose helped initiate a petition that challenged segregation in the public schools of Orangeburg in 1955. Arthur Rose becomes a life member of the NAACP. Later, Arthur Rose marches with students in Orangeburg in 1960 and 1961. And that Arthur Rose is a teacher of the movement, a teacher who trained both Dr. Leo Twiggs and young Cecil Williams.
Yeah, that's awesome. Not much to add here. I just want to give Dr. Cunningham a shout out for that outstanding dissertation that she wrote on teachers, South Carolina. But Cecil's, Mr. Williams' comments are very appropriate because they've helped me quite a bit. There's a narrative in the historiography of the civil rights movement, believe it or not, that teachers were on the sidelines of the movement, that they weren't actively engaged in the movement. And what we've tried to do, what we've been trying to do with this research project is challenge that narrative. And the individual who has been probably one of the most helpful individuals in helping us challenge that narrative has been Mr. Williams, through his incredible scholarship in terms of being a photographer and documenting teachers' involvement in the civil rights movement in terms of their activism in the community, but also in classrooms. So I want to thank him for that work.
Thank you, panelists, for those wonderful comments. So now we will move on to our next clip. And here Dr. Twiggs offers his perspective on whether art should have a political purpose.
All good art is protest art. You can't, when you start painting pictures of the birds and the bees, the sunsets and all that kind of stuff, that might make people feel good. But if you feel good about it, then it seems to me like you're not up on what's going on.
Du Bois and W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke had a somewhat of a debate in the 1920s about art during the Harlem Renaissance, or what some people call the New Negro Literary Movement. And Du Bois wrote an article called Art is Propaganda. And he said, all art is propaganda, and all art must be propaganda. And Locke's response was that all art does not have to have a political message or has to be propaganda. As Black people, we should be able to have art that just express who we are as a people, and it doesn't have to be propaganda. What side would you take? If you
I would say you'd have to express yourself, and sometimes to express yourself, it has to be propaganda, but that's not the sole reason that you should paint. I mean, for me, when I do Birth of Blues, that's not propaganda. What that is about feelings and emotions amazing thing is that art is perhaps the arts, not just the visual arts, but the arts is perhaps the only way that other people can get inside of you. I think white people can understand more about Black people by looking at our music and our art and our literature than they can by anybody just talking about us. You can't go to Fences and not learn something about us. I mean, I remember on Broadway seeing Sidney Poitier in A Raisin in the Sun. And the frustration of this man locked into this thing and wanting to get out and wanting to leave this apartment and be somebody. White people can look at that, and that's why that's why it was so popular, because for a moment there, they saw the frustrations that we feel, the frustrations of being locked into a box. And how else would you say it? I mean, you could stand on the corner all day and say, you know, we're tired of being locked in this box. But until you see something like Fences, until you see A Raisin in the Sun, until you see something like Two Trains Running, I mean, Augusta Wilson, man, that's my, that's my man. It's just a way of saying it. And to say it that way takes intellect. It takes, how do you pick out the most important parts to put in this? How do you make the dialogue, in Alice Walker, when you look at The Color Purple, how do you make the dialogue demanding so that when somebody reads it, I mean, you say, God, I wish I could say it like that. Because some writers can do that.
So in this clip, we got to hear Dr. Twiggs discuss the debate on art being a political message and art portraying feelings and emotions. So panelists, what are your thoughts on this debate and the expression of art as propaganda?
So I'd like to chime in here. I think in terms of art and the messages that artists convey to the receivers of art, really, it certainly is a communication between the artist and the viewer or listener. I think that a case in point that I can think of, especially that's apropos for these times, is my father's paintings. I think most of you know that one of the themes that he has done throughout his career has been of the Confederate flag. He has certainly gotten questions from many people, especially in the South, both black and white, as to why do you, as a black man, paint something that was essentially the symbol of the oppression that black people suffered, certainly through the Jim Crow era, and even to now where it's the symbol that's being utilized by white supremacist groups and others. And as I have assessed the messages that he's tried to send, and in some of my discussions with him, I think the unique thing about the way my father paints, especially things like the Confederate flag, is the medium he uses and the messages that he embeds in those paintings. For instance, if you look at the Confederate flags that you see in media, they are red and they are bold and they jump out at you, not to be missed. The images that my father utilizes in his paintings are ones of muted colors, fading colors. And in my mind and in the mind of many people that I've talked to, what it invokes is essentially the relic of the past, something that is organic, that is fading away, that is passing into into oblivion, for lack of a better term. And I think the medium that he's chosen in batik allows you to see that. And so very difficult to see it in images, but when you look at the nuance of this image that can be so polarizing in terms of what people believe, it's heritage, it's hate, it's honoring my ancestors, it's dishonoring my ancestors, and the ability to use that image to send the message around what it was and what it's becoming is a really important way of not only conveying that message, but engendering a dialogue about what it means, not only to Black people, but to white people as well.
Well, if I could just add just very briefly, and I really encourage the viewers today to take a look at the longer interviews. Both Dr. Twiggs and Mr. Williams both talk about the calling they both feel to be an artist, the calling they both feel to be a photographer. And they also remind us of the training that goes with that calling. And both men, as I mentioned earlier, are trained by Arthur Rhodes, who was a protest artist in his own right. Mr. Williams was trained by men like a man in Columbia, South Carolina named John W. Goodwin, and a man in Sumter named E.C. Jones, both deeply connected to the civil rights movement and used their cameras and their lens to visualize that movement. Dr. Twiggs was trained by Harold Woodruff, an outstanding, renowned 20th century artist and art professor who also used his art as a means for protest. And so I believe both of the gentlemen helped to visualize Du Bois's notion of the souls of Black folk. They helped to animate and to articulate some of the struggles that may not be easily apparent to some people. I've had the good fortune of having Dr. Twiggs and Mr. Williams in my classroom. And that's just a moment as a professor, you just stand back and let the masters take control. And by showing their work, they really help provide a perspective and angle for students that literally opens their eyes to things that were largely overlooked or missing in standard textbooks.
Thank you all for that. Would anyone else like to chime in? Okay, so moving on to our next clip, Dr. Twiggs describes the process by which he developed the Mother Emanuel series.
Question or two, or maybe three, that he would like to pose or ask.
Continuing along the line of thought, after you took in the scene of the individuals and the fact that they were in tears, they were emotionally moved, that ties into what you mentioned earlier about your work being spiritual. Can you make the connection in hindsight that what you had done through the Mother Emanuel series had spiritually impacted the audience as well as emotionally moved them? And how does that resonate with you now, looking back on it?
Oh, that's a great question. And I never thought about that spirituality aspect of it, connecting to what I thought earlier. But I suspect it really does. You know, you don't really know how that comes about. You only paint what you feel. And I think we human beings have this human relationship that's how we connect with each other on a level that is nonverbal, that is through feelings and emotions. I think in life there are themes that are universal. Hate is a universal theme. Love is a universal theme. We all go through the same things. We lose loved ones and we're sad. We fall in love and we're happy. And I think what we call spirituality is tapping into those emotions with other human beings. And I think that with the Mother Emanuel, if you look at those series of paintings, you'll see where the flag at the beginning was stark and out there. And then as you go from one painting to another, it dissipates and then it turns in, and what was the cross, that is the Confederate flag, morphs into crosses of people rising to heaven. I think people feel that, and they felt it in a way that it hit them emotionally. And even though the person said in other works that it was spiritual, I think the events, somebody look at this and say, the spiritual of the blues, that doesn't impact you in a way when somebody gets killed. It just impacts you in a way where you can see all the, nobody knows the trouble we've seen. That's what that says. But if something impacts you in a way, then your response is differently. When I was doing the Mother Emanuel series, the last painting, I knew I had to end it because I was doing 9. And I wondered how I would do that. And I thought about Handel's Messiah, that Hallelujah chorus and people stood up because you do this thing. But what would I say to end this? Because sometimes what you say to end it has to be the culmination of what you said to begin with. And then I really thought, even when I was on number 8 and number 7, I was thinking, what will I say to end it? And then I remember listening to James Weldon Johnson's song and concentrated on a line that says, "We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered." And that is Mother Emanuel. That's what happened to those folks there. And so, but this is writing and I'm painting. So how do I say that visually? And how do I say it the way it says? We have come, and then da-da-da-da-da. We have come, and then da-da-da-da-da. And so I'm thinking about how to do this in my mind. And then I remember that in Charleston, while I was at the gallery looking out over there, I could see the Fisherman's Wharf where they brought the slaves in. I went to the old slave market music. And I remember, I thought, what would it be like, when I did that painting for these people who were down in the holes of slave ships and they first come up on the bow to look out and the sun didn't rise the same place it was. They didn't see anything that looked like their home country. And so I put in these series of things that represented their home country. And I put this horizon there. And I don't know how it happened in the providence of it, that cross rose just above the horizon. And I thought, our saving grace was the Christianity. That's what made us, that's what saved us. That we believe that a better day was coming. We believe that we have many rivers to cross, but we're gonna get to the other side. And that was the way I ended it. And I made the letters so that when you looked at it, it was there, but it wasn't so stark that you'd see it right away. But putting, we have come. So if you're standing back where all you see is we have come, and the closer you get, you'd see over a way that with tears has been watered. And then that's how I ended.
So in this clip, we got to hear Dr. Twiggs discuss the connection of emotion, spirituality, and history while he developed the Mother Emanuel series. So panelists, would you please comment on what emotions or thoughts you had while viewing this clip?
I conducted this interview and I remember it very well. And it was a spiritual experience. Now, before going to this interview with Dr. Twiggs, I had a list of questions that I planned to ask him. That went out of the window pretty quickly. And I knew very soon that this was going to be an organic experience and I wasn't going to get in his way with asking him a list of questions. But one question I did ask him, I asked him a few, but one that I really remember his response to well, is I asked him, where did he get his inspiration to write? And he said that he would, not write, but to do his work, to paint. And he said that he tried to do it every day, but he said that he read books and that he also listened to music and that music and reading helped stimulate his thinking for him to do his work. And it was just really an experience to be in his space as well, to see the instruments that he used in his craft. And so it was an incredible experience. And I encourage you all to watch the entire interview. And Ryan Hathcock did the interview with me, and we talked about it on the way home. And Ryan, you may remember that experience too.
To get off of what Dr. Donaldson mentioned earlier, when you're in the presence of a master, you really allow them the space to speak and to educate you. And in that moment in time, because we were just coming off of the celebration of the Mother Emanuel, the acknowledgement of the tragedy through his work, looking back on it now from today's webinar, it seems almost eerie that the words he spoke in those moments are as profound today. And the artist level of excellence that he's showing and giving us today reminds me that the work continues through his work, through our observation of the work and acknowledgement of the deeper meaning, the spiritual connectivity with those we've lost and those who are still remaining. And again, it just reiterates the importance of how we embrace the movement, the civil rights movement, past, present, and into the future, acknowledging the contributions of not just teachers, but the artists who are painting, who are sculpting, who are acknowledging these moments through their genius for us to continue to keep the conversations going, to ensure that those we've lost are not forgotten, but we are working to make tomorrow a better tomorrow for the children who are coming behind us. And sitting in his office, sitting in his laboratory, as it were, was just a phenomenal, stirring moment in time that I will never, ever forget.
I'll say it was a real powerful moment watching this and watching it over and over again. And I want to commend Dr. Aldridge and Ryan for just helping to shape this conversation. It's so important to have artists and photographers to have a space to articulate their craft in ways that you may not fully understand going into a gallery or seeing on a wall. You have a very different perspective. So when young Leo Twiggs was a student at Claflin, he majored in art, but he also majored in English, and he also majored in history. And so in this Mother Emanuel series, he's really visualized the arc of history in this piece. We've come. He's reminding people of enslavement. He's reminding people of the Middle Passage. He's reminding people of Denmark Vesey in Charleston. We've come. He's reminding all of us of the Black men who fought to end slavery during the Civil War. He's reminding us of Black men and women who shaped Reconstruction. We've come. He's reminding us of a young artist in Charleston whose name was Edwin Halston, who himself was a civil rights leader and an artist in Charleston during World War I, helped to found the NACP in 1917 that Dr. Cunningham mentioned. We've come. He talks about those men and women in Mother Emanuel who were staunch civil rights leaders throughout the 20th century. We've come. He's talking about a man he knew well named Fred Henderson Moore, a student from Charleston who engaged in civil rights protests in 1955 and 1956, and who was expelled only weeks short of graduating from South Carolina State University in Orangeburg. And so in just a matter of a few moments, he's really captured an amazing window of time. And so again, I want to applaud this project for giving these men and other individuals the space to really walk us literally through history.
And I just wanted to quickly add, it's Mother Emanuel AME Church. And when we talk about spirituality, we also have to think about religion and the role of the church. One of the reasons the AME Church in particular is so important in South Carolina is because it provided a safe space. The only really other safe space was private historically Black colleges. And even sometimes those colleges received funding from whites. They had teachers and administrators that were white. The AME Church provided a space that was from top all the way to the bottom, funded and operated by African Americans. And so by the time we get to the 1940s, we start seeing some of these ministers like Reverend Delane, like James Hinton, like Reverend E. Richburg, who say, I can no longer essentially guide my flock without also addressing some of these social issues. And so for African Americans, I think we see a very long history of these social issues correlating very much with what's happening spiritually, right? And not seeing as much of a separation from between those two things.
And just to expand on what Professor Donaldson spoke about in terms of this, a little bit of the history and context. Growing up in Orangeburg, South Carolina, that history that he talked about in terms of the connectedness between people like Edward Halston and Arthur Rose, my father, Cecil Williams, it was one that was lived every day. There were people who were related to Edwin Halston who taught at South Carolina State University. Arthur Rose essentially became my godfather. I'd be closer than that. I called him Uncle Rose. And having him in my life, being my father's teacher, and then having the ability to engage with him and to see this man who not only was a poor kid who grew up in a really difficult circumstances in Charleston, South Carolina, become a well-known artist in his own right, and then teach other artists about not only the craft, but the history and methodology and how you turn ideas into things was certainly something that benefited me, as a person growing up in South Carolina, and certainly was something that certainly my brothers and other students who had the privilege of growing up in the 1970s and 80s, still be connected and maintain that connectedness to all of those who came before us and the paths that they paved so we could have the opportunities that we had.
Thank you, panelists, so much for commenting on the Mother Emanuel series. So in this final segment, Mr. Twiggs, it's Mr. Williams, sorry. Mr. Williams discusses the Orangeburg Massacre, a seminal event in South Carolina's civil rights movement.
I know that you were there when the Orangeburg Massacre took place, or you took photographs of that. Could you talk some about that?
Well, the Orangeburg Massacre situation was something that one of the few violent periods or times in the state. Most of the earlier demonstrations and marches did not end up in very much danger to the citizens engaged in them. But the Orangeburg Massacre was a little different. It happened that in 1968, there were pockets of resistance throughout the South and here in Orangeburg. And one of them was the Orangeburg Bowling Alley. And the Orangeburg Bowling Alley, if you walked on Main Street to downtown Orangeburg, you would encounter a sign on the street that said, even in 1968, white only. And students were offended by that. And plus those students who really wanted to bowl had nowhere to go. They would have to go all the way to Columbia, South Carolina, 40 miles away to bowl. So there began this push to bring down that as a barrier. Ultimately, though, it led to the death of 3 students and the wounding of 27 others when South Carolina Highway Patrolmen fired into a crowd of 250 students with double-aught shotguns, and again, killing 3. And of course, that impacted my life, and I am even affected by today seeing students who I knew. At the time, I was the yearbook photographer for Claflin University and also South Carolina State. So every day I would see the 2 South Carolina State students who died. And it happened that I also had photographed a student from Wilkinson High School, Delano Milton, in my doing of yearbooks for the high schools as well. But this was so unnecessary, and it was really one of the tragedies that has repercussions even today. No one was found guilty with that, even though they had all the evidence. I was not actually at the site when the shooting took place, merely because I could not really get back to that area when the shooting took place. Otherwise, I would have been there because I was there when the students were doing all the other things, including when this event, you might say, first begun. But it's something that I look back, we're now today celebrating the 50th observance of this, and say it seemed that today's police brutality towards African-American youth, they don't seem to kind of put together the fact that this happened so many years ago, and really just a continuation of what happened in 1968, when 9 highway patrolmen just shot into a crowd, having no respect for African-American life. This is so, it's an evil. It has to be something that is based on race for them to not have the respect for human life to fire into a crowd of students. I mean, it's unimaginable that this would happen, but nevertheless it did on February the 8th, 1968.
So given the historical moment that we're currently experiencing, I'm wondering, panelists, do you have any comments on the historical significance of the Orangeburg Massacre in its time in 1968, as well as any correlation that it has to today's movement?
I'll begin by reminding the viewers that the tragedy that Mr. Williams just spoke about took place on February 8th of 1968. And what happened on that night when 3 young men were killed and dozens and dozens and dozens were injured, far more than the 30 that's often quoted. That was not an isolated event. I mean, what happened in Orangeburg on February 8th had been building for some time. This is 1968. This is 5 years after the March on Washington. It is 4 years after the Civil Rights Bill has been passed, 3 years after the Voting Rights Bill has been passed. And these are young men and women in Orangeburg and elsewhere who are wondering, when will change come? And so the year before, they had been protesting events on campus in the community. And in this window of time in February of & they're protesting continued segregation in Orangeburg. And what happened that night was an abuse of law enforcement. And just to show you the connections, on February 13th, 1968, the Justice Department received a memo condemning the destructive use of police power and called for a national movement to address the assaults of Black youth, Black students by law enforcement. February 13th, 1968. Well, that memo to the Justice Department was written by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who wanted to use the Orangeburg incident, the Orangeburg Massacre, as it was later called, to speak about the abuses of law enforcement, the abuses of quote unquote law and order, and how it is being used to undermine the movement of the civil rights struggle, and particularly the movement of young people. And so here we are now in 2020, seeing a repeat of some of those very same struggles. And I think part of what I know is important is for many of the young men and women today who are engaged in the Black Lives Matter movement to understand that Dr. Twiggs is right. We have come over a way with tears have been watered. We've come treading through the path of the blood of the slaughtered. And to recognize the movement today builds on many long-standing goals and hopes, deferred dreams from generations ago.
I'll just build on that. And Dr. Donaldson mentioned earlier massive white resistance. And when we think about the students in Orangeburg, these college students, one of the things to bear in mind is that this is the continuum that moves forwards and backwards, right? And South Carolina State college students, Claflin college students had been participating in the movement since the 1950s. Here we see an episode of physical violence, but I think it's also important to bear in mind the type of economic repercussions, really economic violence that African Americans face because of their activism. And college students were in no way protected from that. And certainly students at South Carolina State were especially susceptible. Bear in mind, South Carolina State also served a student body that included students who came from working class backgrounds. So when South Carolina's segregationists then pressured the administrators at South Carolina State to expel these students, that expulsion was not a temporary loss for them, right? This could therefore mean a complete change in the trajectory of their life because they may or may not have been able to continue their education. So African Americans, college students in particular, had been facing a type of violence in South Carolina for a very long time. And what we see happening in Orangeburg was very much a kind of a buildup to that.
For me, growing up in Orangeburg, one of my classmates was the brother of Donald Middleton. So certainly from a community standpoint, while we were certainly not familiar with the students and were too young to remember the incident at all, and only heard about it through stories and through the yearly commemorations, which are done at South Carolina State, remembering the 3 students, the fact that that event happened, the rationale, the reasons, the involvement of the law enforcement along with the local communities, the local community and community members in Orangeburg were certainly well known and did have reverberations beyond 1968. A quick story. One of the we had a bowling league as a child, and the students were at that time protesting, again, their inability to use the bowling alley. As a child, I participated in a bowling league that bowled at the alley that was owned by the person who refused to let the students bowl. And so while we like to think that some of these moments happen and they provide seminal change where there is an effort or movement, I think we often remember that there's a continuum, and some of you spoke about that on the panel here. There's a continuum. The people who were there in the community, who were opposed, are still in the community, and these changes happen over time. And so, if you again to talk to what we talk about in terms of continuum, things come before, things come after, and unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, the things that are happening today are simply part of that continuum. We've come a long way, but we still have a ways to go. And so I think that's something that certainly the activists today will need to remember. This isn't a moment. This isn't a 1-week initiative. This isn't a set of protests that will happen for the next week. This is something that has to be active and ongoing if real change is to be effective.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you so much for that rich discussion. So if nobody else has anything they would like to comment, we will begin our Q&A segment shortly. Please enter your questions or comments into the Q&A feature and leave your name and affiliation as well. First, however, we are very excited to have with us today Dr. Leo Twiggs and Mr. Cecil Williams. We'll turn the floor over to them to provide a few words of wisdom.
Am I on? Am I to speak? Hello?
Yes, you can go right ahead.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure of mine to be on this with you today, and especially with Dr. Twiggs. We are both colleagues, and I'm very proud to be a part of this. I'd like to first say that I'm very pleased that there's a renewed interest in history. I call myself somewhat of a historian, having captured many of the events of the civil rights movement. But it also brings to the forefront the power of imagery. Dr. Twiggs and I both have been users of that great power to be able to take a single image and then create something on canvas, or in my particular case, on the photographic paper. And the imagery is so very important. Just think about the imagery we saw when George Floyd was held on the ground with that of a highway patrolman, with a city policeman, and the impact that has had on this country. And to renew the effort to bring about the changes evidently were not significant enough during the times of the civil rights movement and all the laws that have been passed since then. But all my life, as a person that used imagery in my coverage, both as a professional photographer, as a photographer for Jet Magazine, and as a photographer of course, with the photographs that I have in my publications, I have continued down that line with in taking pictures. It's part of the process that I do today, because I am still a photographer today. But I like to include in my pictures all of the elements that go to the telling of the story of what that picture, and then exclude everything out. And that's also kind of brought over into my liking for what is called minimalism. Minimalism and a very simple simplicity of what's in my images. And I feel that that has helped me to hone my craft so that I can become a better, or you might say, artist and photographer. I also have to mention here that one of the reasons I kind of navigated over very early to photography, Dr. Twiggs, you ought to appreciate this, was the fact that I could never draw as well as I wanted to. So the camera made it very easy for me to say, just press a button, and of course, resulting in some type of picture that had a storytelling quality. Thank you for letting me add these comments.
I'm muted.
We can hear you, Dr. Twiggs.
Now you're muted.
Do you hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay. One of my favorite writers is a man named James Baldwin. I know you all know who he is. While I was at NYU, I read The Fire Next Time, Another Country, Giovanni's Room, but I like most of all his essays. And one of the things he said in his essays that has been a guiding point for me was, the purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers. That became my dictum. That became my philosophy of what I was creating. And so when you listen at that, when people say, oh, it's not about racism, it's about heritage. When people say, I don't understand why you folks don't know what that means. When people say, some of my best friends are Black people. Those are the answers. What I like to do is penetrate through that, the questions that raises. And so I've done that all my life in my art. And Arthur Rose, you mentioned earlier, once said, I remember when the massacre happened in Orangeburg, he said, I'm gonna paint me a picture, Jim. And when he said that, I knew that he was gonna go in the studio and he was gonna make something happen. And so as an artist, you have to take those things and put them into some kind of a metaphor. You know, I said about what happened to Floyd is that the metaphor is not a knee, the compression of a knee on a neck. The metaphor is the oppression of a people. And that's what you have to see. In Floyd, we have had a knee on our necks forever. And it's time for us to get some knees off our necks. And as a visual artist, I'm doing a piece now about that. But one of the things as a visual artist that you have to remember is that you can't let the anger get in the way of the art. The art is a way of an aesthetic way of showing something, of doing something. And so what I do is I have to process it, and all artists process it. Because if art is going to be endearing and enduring, it must live beyond the moment that it's created. That's why the Guernica still lives for us. About Picasso painting this picture about what happened to a town in Spain, but when we look at it now, we don't even know the story, but we know it's about something significant. And what it has done, it has really touched the hearts of people. And so I hope that happens with the Mother Emanuel series, that years from now, you won't remember Mother Emanuel, the image of that, the picture of the church, but you'll know what happened there. And what happened there will still move you in the way it did move me when I did it.
May I add one comment? One of the things that motivates me then and now, and I notice it's very evident today with many artists, is that of being really passionate about our craft. This passion drove me to be on the scene and at the site of so many civil rights movement all through the years. And it was because of that passion and that drive that I thought I put myself in a position to be not only an eyewitness and a participant, but also I captured those moments in history. But even today, this passion has driven me, and this passion has been in a way characterized by an inner voice. I have this little inner voice. I think it's in all of us if we just pause and listen to it. This little inner voice that talks to you. The soul, maybe, whatever. But this little inner voice also today leads me to, okay, I've taken all these 600,000 images doing a multi-decade career, but now what do I do with them? This same passion that drove me to take pictures of the elderly school teachers and those brave pioneers, some of which we know about and some we don't, has driven me today to really start a museum in Orangeburg. And I'd like to invite everyone on this panel and everyone listening today to sometimes maybe when COVID-19 is no longer a part of our present, that come down and visit my museum, and you will see what I have assembled that is called the Cecil Williams Civil Rights Museum. Of course, today you can also visit it virtually. But thank you for letting me add these comments.
Okay, great. So thank you, panelists and our moderators and Mr. Williams and Mr. Twiggs. I'm here to help facilitate our Q&A process. Please continue to put any questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen for Zoom. Panelists, our first question comes from Chris. How did the integration of schools affect Black teachers and administrators in the state of South Carolina?
Well, I can speak to that a bit. It probably impacted them exactly the way that you think it did, which was that many of them lost their positions, but in a series of ways, right? And so for some teachers, this meant that they lost leadership positions, in particular principals would sometimes be demoted to the role of teacher. They were also impacted sometimes in the types of classes they could teach. So for instance, I spoke to one teacher actually from Orangeburg who taught French. And when schools integrated and she started teaching at a predominantly white school, they kept trying to get her to teach English. And she had to really fight to teach for this, this class that she'd been teaching for by that point a decade. Another way that it's impacted, I think we don't think about as much, is the Teachers Association. And so South Carolina's Black school teachers had their own Teachers Association, the Palmetto Education Association. And the reason why it was so important is not only did it provide this kind of professional space, but it also provided another means for which African-American teachers could sort of fight for themselves. And so the Black Teachers Association was very much in partnership with the NAACP. There comes a certain point when these teachers associations have to merge, the Black and White Teachers Associations. And so one of the things African-American teachers do lose upon integration is having their own professional association that can really fight on their behalf and understand their specific set of struggles.
Yes, I personally witnessed some of the impact on African-American teachers. Well into the 1980s, there was something in South Carolina called a certificate and a B certificate for teachers, right? And for a long time, my mother was teaching after teaching at Black schools, and then once schools desegregated, she was teaching for a long time on what was called a B certificate. And a B certificate, with a B certificate, you made less money than those who had an A certificate. Needless to say, most of the people who had an A certificate were white, and most of the people who had the B certificate were African-American. The requirement to get an A certificate was that you had to pass the National Teachers Examination. I clearly remember studying with my mother, helping her with it, my brother and I, until she took the test several times. And it wasn't until the 1980s that she was making the salary of most of her white peers at the school that she taught. So that was just one example of how affected Black teachers. And a number of teachers that I grew up with and I knew, in the 60s, growing up in the 60s, just simply lost their jobs. And some of them went back and served as substitute teachers. And I remember that. And it was a painful experience for the community to see that happen in Rock Hill.
I can speak to that if you unmute me.
We can hear you. Go ahead.
He talked about A certificates and B certificates. I worked at a school in Sumter, South Carolina, where when many of our faculty people started making A's, they upped the scores so that you had an A certificate if you made 545, but if you made 600, then you got more money. So what happened is they watered down the A because so many of my colleagues were making A's, so that they'd have to make a higher score to get more money. So that was in play as well.
Great, thank you. We had one comment from Denise. She is a Hampton University grad and been teaching music for the last 34 years. She had a comment about current teachers that are now involved in the movement. And I was gonna pitch this to the panelists or anyone who wanted to sort of comment or add on to that as we wrap up in the next 3 to 4 minutes.
I'd like to just say that we've been asked, the teachers that we interview are teachers who taught between 1950 and 1980, which would be the classical civil rights movement through what's called the post-civil rights period. Over the last year, we have received requests from people for us to consider interviewing teachers who are in this current movement called Black Lives Matter. or in other social justice movements. So I definitely agree with what Denise said, that teachers are continuing. I like to think of what Vincent Harding talked about when he talked about the long Black freedom struggle. He said, the Black freedom struggle is not a discrete period of time where we separate the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, but rather the movement is a long flowing river, and that all of these activities are on this river that's meandering. And so what we want to do moving forward is to begin to document what teachers in the classroom are doing now, and to connect their stories to the legacy of what teachers were doing in the 1950s through the 1980s, during the previous movement. So it's something that we're thinking about.
And I'll just briefly add, in the last weekend, here in Columbia, South Carolina, there were two major marches. There was one on Sunday that was a powerful moment called the Black Million Man March. Yeah. Largely African-American men walking the streets of Columbia, the same route of many civil rights protests. And I took my son to that one so he could witness this moment. But the previous day, that Saturday, there was a movement called Teachers for Black Lives Matter. Teachers from multiple backgrounds, ethnicities, on the grounds of the State House, committing themselves to support the current movement, but also connecting the current movement about Black Lives Matters to the inequities in public school education in South Carolina that limits their own ability to be successful as educators, particularly in rural, underserved areas. Readers may be interested to know that there is an 1895 Constitution in South Carolina that is still the Constitution of our state. And that Constitution says we are required as a state to provide, quote, a minimally adequate education to our students. And so there are teachers, there are parents, there are young people saying that is insufficient. That is not enough. And if we're going to move the needle forward, we need to improve on multiple fronts, on health inequities, on housing, on jobs, and most specifically in education. So the current struggle is directly connected to the issues of education as well.
I would say that in terms of the context for today, I think that there's a unique opportunity to, I don't want to say change the narrative, but renew the efforts that I think have been attempted and started, but have never really crystallized, perhaps in the last 45 or 50 years into, I think, what we're seeing today in terms of young people being very, very energized around this movement called Black Lives Matter, and looking to effect real change. And what I would say is that, this project has helped to identify some really important people who, for lack of better words, served in the fight before. When you look at folks like Cecil Williams here, arguably Cecil Williams is one of the most important photographers in the last 50 years. Certainly, if not the most important photographer in certainly the civil rights movement over the last 55, 60 years. His body of work captures essentially what became this initial flame of a struggle through the 1970s, when all the legislation was passed. It's unbelievable to me, and I've told him this, so he knows it, is that we still, we look at photos in magazines and we see some of the iconic photos of people like Martin Luther King and others, but in terms of the seminal body of work, there's nothing in this country that approaches what he's done, what he did between 1950 and 1970. It just doesn't exist. And so we've got those resources that we can draw upon. We've got the experiences of people like my father, who was a teacher. I mean, let's not forget that while he's certainly a well-known artist, he was a teacher for 40 years, for almost 50 years. So let's remember that that's the legacy that they have. Cecil Williams, again, a photographer, but also a teacher. There are a line of people who can point back to him, teaching them the roots of photography, how to be photographers, employing them in high school and in college. So when you link, these two people that we're talking about to here to, teaching and the movement, we have them to draw upon. And so I think that's something that we all should be aware of and use that resource to serve as an example for what needs to come based on their own experiences in their fight.
I'd just like to say, for those of us who teach teachers, that moving forward, the work of Mr. Cecil Williams and Dr. Leo Twiggs should be required texts in teacher education for those who are pursuing the career of teaching and who are interested in being involved in this current movement, because by studying the work of these two men, they are engaging with texts, so to speak, that can help them understand the present movement. All right.
Well, this concludes our third Teachers in the Movement discussion in our webinar series. First, I'd like to thank you, audience, for your questions. Thank you, panelists, as well, for the entire discussion, as well as those really informative answers you provided towards the end during our Q&A. Also, we do acknowledge that there were some questions that we were unable to get to. So if you all would like to continue the conversation with us, please do email us at teachersinthemovement@gmail.com. So we really like to extend our sincere thanks to everyone for joining us today. We are especially thankful to our co-sponsors, the Center for Civil Rights History and Research, the Center for the Education and Equity of African American Students, and Charlottesville's Epsilon Psi Boule of Sigma Pi Phi Fraternity. Please be sure, everyone, to follow us on social media at Teachers in the Movement and use hashtag #KimWebinar Series. Please also visit our website, www.teachersinthemovement.com, for more interviews and our webinars in the video library. Also, if you all happen to know of anyone who we may be able to interview for the Teachers in the Movement project, please also feel free to email us. And be sure to be on the lookout for our next webinar in this series, and we sincerely hope that you will join us again. Thank you.